Imagine getting a phone call right now telling you to leave everything, your home, your job, your community, and just go. No destination given. Would you do it? Today, we're diving into one of history's most profound acts of faith, Abraham's journey in Genesis 12. We'll explore what it means to step into the unknown and how one person's leap of faith changed the course of human history.
You know, what's fascinating about this story is that Abraham, or Abram as he was called then, wasn't some spiritual superhero when God called him. The book of Joshua actually tells us he came from a family of pagan worshippers.
Wait, really? So God didn't choose him because he was already perfect?
Not at all. And that's what makes this story so remarkable. God called him purely out of grace, not because of anything Abraham had done.
So what exactly did God ask him to do?
Well, according to Genesis 12:1, God said, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you." Notice, he didn't even tell Abraham where he was going.
That's a pretty big ask.
Huge. But with this massive ask came some incredible promises. God said he would make Abraham into a great nation, bless him, make his name great, and that through him all families of the earth would be blessed.
You know what's interesting? The text says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram," suggesting this wasn't the first time God spoke to him about this.
Exactly. According to Acts 7, Yeast 2:4, God actually first appeared to Abraham in Mesopotamia before he even moved to Haran.
So he didn't immediately pack up and leave everything?
No, and this is really important. Abraham's initial response was partial obedience. He moved, but not completely as God had asked. He took his father and settled in Haran first.
Did that mess up God's plan for him?
Actually, no. The promise wasn't canceled, it was just delayed until Abraham was ready for complete obedience. It shows us that faith is often a growth process.
You know, speaking of numbers, I found something interesting. The number 12 shows up a lot in scripture, doesn't it?
Oh yes, exactly, 187 times. It's fascinating because 12 represents divine authority and completeness in biblical symbolism.
That's incredible. So when we're reading Genesis 12, we're not just reading about a journey, but about God establishing his divine authority through Abraham?
Precisely. And what's really profound is how God structured his promises to Abraham. There were three main components.
Can you break those down for us?
First, God promised him land, specifically Canaan. Second, he promised to make him into a great nation. And third, he promised to bless him and make him a blessing to others.
And these weren't small promises.
Not at all. In fact, God said, "I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." This promise has had historical implications throughout the ages.
Really? How so?
Well, historically, nations that treated Abraham's descendants well often prospered. For instance, when the Greeks overran Palestine and desecrated the temple, they were soon conquered by Rome.
And then what happened to Rome?
When Rome later destroyed Jerusalem under Titus and persecuted many believers, including Paul, Rome itself eventually fell.
That's fascinating. You know, there's something else interesting about Abraham's call. It was specifically to leave Babylon, right?
Yes, Ur of the Chaldeans was in Babylonia. And this call to come out of Babylon becomes a recurring theme throughout Scripture.
Almost like a spiritual metaphor?
Exactly. It represents leaving behind worldly influences and systems that oppose God's ways.
But it wasn't easy for Abraham, was it?
No, and that's what makes his story so relatable. He had moments of great faith and moments of struggle.
Can you give us an example?
Well, even after following God's call, when famine hit, Abraham went down to Egypt, and out of fear, he asked Sarah to say she was his sister rather than his wife.
So he wasn't perfect?
Not at all. But that's actually encouraging. It shows that God can work through imperfect people who are willing to trust him.
You mentioned earlier that Abraham's call came with universal implications. What did you mean by that?
Well, God said through Abraham all families of the earth would be blessed. This wasn't just about one man or one nation. It was about God's plan for all humanity.
That's quite a responsibility to put on one person's shoulders.
True, but remember, the focus isn't on Abraham's ability, but on God's faithfulness to fulfill his promises.
And did Abraham ever see all these promises fulfilled in his lifetime?
Actually, no. Hebrews 11:8 tells us he went out not knowing where he was going and lived as a stranger in the promised land.
Yet he's still considered the father of faith.
Yes, because faith isn't about seeing everything fulfilled. It's about trusting God's promises, even when we can't see how they'll work out.
You know what strikes me? The text repeatedly uses the phrase, "I will," when God makes his promises.
That's a crucial observation. Genesis 11 was all about human plans. Let us build. Let us make a name for ourselves. But Genesis 12 shifts to what God will do.
So it's not about human achievement?
Not at all. It's about God's initiative and his faithfulness to fulfill his promises, even when we're not perfect in our response.
That's actually quite encouraging.
It is. And you know what's remarkable? Abraham's name literally means exalted father, but God later changed it to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude.
That's quite a promotion.
Yes, and it shows how God's calling often transforms not just our circumstances, but our very identity.
So what can we learn from Abraham's journey today?
I think one key lesson is that faith is a journey, not a destination. Abraham grew in his faith over time, through both successes and failures.
And God was patient with that process?
Absolutely. The promises didn't depend on Abraham's perfect performance, but on God's faithfulness.
That's pretty relevant for anyone feeling inadequate in their faith journey.
Exactly. And remember, Abraham started as a pagan from Ur. If God could use him, he can use anyone who's willing to trust and follow.
So what you're saying is, it's never too late to start?
Never. Abraham was 75 when God called him. Age, background, past mistakes, none of these disqualify us from God's purposes.
That's powerful. Any final thoughts on Abraham's journey?
I think what's most remarkable is how his personal journey of faith became a blueprint for all believers. His story shows us that faith often means stepping into the unknown.
And trusting that God will fulfill his promises, even if we don't see them all in our lifetime.
Exactly. Abraham's journey reminds us that true faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to take the first step.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Co-Pilot Podcasts. Remember, whether you're facing your own call to step out in faith, or just trying to trust God's promises in your daily life, Abraham's journey shows us that it's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to follow.
And just like Abraham became a blessing to all nations, your step of faith today might impact more lives than you could ever imagine. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Genesis 12. Until next time, keep stepping forward in faith.